Being recorded. My name is Dana Lombardi, and I'm running this Zoom meeting on behalf of the World War I Historical Association. This is September 12th, 2020, and our speaker, Jim O'Donnell, is a member of our San Francisco East Bay or Bay Area chapter, and he's, as Sal said, a tour guide. He's spoken many times before our group, and today he's talking on Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. If you have a question, put it in the chat box area, and I will then present that to Jim, or he can read it at the end of Jim's talk. So if you also want to see Jim, you can put it on speaker view if you have not done that already, or you could just leave it on just watching the PowerPoint screen. Anyway, I'm going to keep everybody muted, as I said, until we do the Q&A at the end, when I will unmute people who want to ask a question or who have put a question in the chat box. Again, this is usually on the top right. So at this point, I will turn it over to Jim. And thank you, Jim, for giving us this talk today.
Well, thank you for the intro. I do want to, I have been part of this organization for 20 years. I think I joined in 2000, so this is 2020, and it's been a lot of fun. I originally started at the age of 9 studying World War II, and that was kind of my big bailiwick for many years. And then I started taking a look at what's going on with the association here, and we had, and World War I was the topic most of the time, and I really didn't know that much about it. But the more I get into it, the more I like reading and finding out about World War I, even more than World War II. Well, actually, World War II, of course, was kind of an extension of World War I. Without World War I, you wouldn't have World War II, right? So let's get right into this. The reason I jumped on this when Sal asked me to do something about Roosevelt, and I said, okay, I think you mentioned Wilson too, and I said, okay, let's give some, so I'm gonna give some background about both men, and they are my two favorite presidents. So it's kind of fun for me. So that's what I'm doing, and we're gonna get right into it. So we're gonna talk about their careers, background, but also, like as Sal mentioned, a contentious relationship. Not always, but we're going to talk about that relationship between the two men, especially the build-up to World War I. So here we go. I can get this to advance. Let's see here. There we go. There's this picture of the two men. This is about when they became president. I think that was right when Teddy Roosevelt became president in 1901 after the assassination of McKinley. And this is Wilson when he became president of the United States in 1913. So let's talk about Teddy Roosevelt a bit, because he got a bit of a head start on Wilson, because Wilson came into the political realm quite a bit later in his life. One of the things I noticed about Roosevelt to get started was while he was going to Columbia Law School, of course he went to Harvard, and he wrote this history of the Naval War of 1812 while he was in school. And then also when he went on vacation, he took his books with him and did his research, and it's considered quite a good historical work. And of course, he wrote about 20 books in his days, and he wrote numerous magazine articles. So he actually was a pretty good writer. I read one of his books, which was the one he wrote during World War I, and I'm going to talk about that later. But one thing he also did when he was at Columbia Law School was he was really itching to move into politics. And so he spent 8 months hanging around Morton Hall. Now, most of you have heard of the more famous hall in New York City, which is known as Tammany Hall. And I never even heard of this Morton Hall until I started looking at this. And that's where the Republican Party headquarters was. And they had their own party bosses too. And Joe Murray was a red-haired Irishman, not unusual for New York. He put TR up, had a good relationship with him. He thought he had a lot of potential, and he put him up for New York Assembly seat. Of course, he won at the age of 23. Pretty early start for him. And of course, he's at Albany in the state government. But of course, he started out with, wants everything his own way, but then he began to develop more of an ability to compromise and work with other people, and also work with the Democrats as well. And he had a pretty good working relationship with Grover Cleveland, who later, of course, became president of the United States. But also he began to develop relationships with journalists from the major papers and magazines. And he really, of all the presidents I've read about, he really did it way beyond what had been done before. He actually started using some of these journalists as investigators for him, because we'll talk more about that later. And of course, these were the journalists that were considered muckrakers. You know, they're looking to go after the corruption and the mismanagement and all the things that weren't working so well in the late 19th century. But also, he started changing his position as time went on and put him in conflict with the Republican Old Guard. And we're going to talk more about them because his party was the party of big business. During that period of time, also the Democrats, they had their own old guard as well, but the Democrats began to appeal more to the working man. And of course, labor and so forth. We'll talk more about that. So let's move on to a little bit more about him. Now, he had a huge tragedy, and most of you have heard about this. In February of 1884, both his wife and his mother die on the same day. So and he was totally couldn't be consolated. He was absolutely depressed. And so he finally decided, okay, I'm going to quit, because he finished out the rest of 1884 and his heart wasn't in it. And then he said, well, I'm going to head out west. So he bought a couple of ranches. Of course, he got into business with a couple of guys that were pretty good ranchmen. And they, of course, could take over the ranches when he left and went back east, which he did in about a year and a half. And of course, when he returned, of course, he wrote a couple of books. He wrote a book, The Hunting Trip, hunting. Let's see if I can see what I have on the front here. But anyway, you can see it on the screen there. And lots of magazine articles. Like he was writing articles for like Field and Stream, all these outdoorsman kind of magazines and so forth. And of course, he returned to New York, and guess what? He found a woman, Edith Carroll, who was an old childhood friend. They'd grown up together. They'd played together when they were kids. And of course, she always wanted to marry PR, but of course, he married somebody else, but then she passed away. But he also was a good party man, because they said, we want you to run for New York mayoral race against the Tammany Hall candidate in New York. And of course, he knew he was probably going to lose. And so but he still bit the bullet and showed himself a good trooper. And so that paid off later when he became ran for governor of New York. But he also, Benjamin Harrison, who was a Republican president, took over for Grover Cleveland in 1888, 89, and he appoints TR a civil service commissioner. Now, what's interesting about that late 19th century is there was no civil service commission really before 1883. If there was one, I guess they reformed it a little earlier, but they had no teeth. They had the commission was like a 3-man commission. They had no staff. It was just the 3 of them, and they're supposed to run the whole country, check out what's going on. And of course, the entrenched patronage practices were still in place in most places. And it wasn't until TR and his other, mostly it was him, but he started checking out what's going on. Now, he didn't have a staff, so he started using these journalists like William Allen White. I'm going to talk about more of these muckraking journalists in a second or two. But they went after all the corrupt civil servants in customs and postal services. In fact, we found in customs office, of course, that's the biggest port in the United States, New York City. And so the customs, there was all kinds of corruption going on there. And not only that, but the commission, the head of the customs there was also sending the tests, the civil service tests, but they're all supposed to take, right, up to what they call the art department, which means they altered the scores to make sure that the people that he wanted in got in. So it was just another version of patronage. He just was fudging the numbers. And so that was one of the guys that William Allen White went after, reporting back to TR, just like he was a paid investigator, and he got the guy thrown out. And eventually he got Postmaster General Wanamaker, who was a crony of Benjamin Harrison, because it was a big job in those days. In fact, it was the Postmaster General sat on the cabinet, was a cabinet member. So what happened was that he finally got him up. So, and Grover Cleveland, of course, had a pretty good relationship with TR. And when he became president again, he decided to keep Roosevelt, even though he was a Republican, and he lasted another couple more years in civil service because he'd done such a good job following up and getting rid of the corruption and starting to get the civil service to act like they were supposed to on a merit-based system. What's next for him? Lots more coming. Okay, here are the 5 of the muckraking reporters that TR had a really strong relationship with all these people except Ida Tarvel. Now, Ida Tarvel is probably the most famous journalist of that whole period. He had sort of arm's length relationship with her, but they did, it wasn't like she was going out investigating for him. But the articles that she wrote were very much in line with what the other people were doing. But the other man you see on here, William Allen White, he had the longest term relationship with TR because he started working with him in the Civil Service Commission. The man in the middle is Ray Baker. And Ray Baker was really following all the labor activity, like the big mine strike in Colorado and so forth. And he was definitely making sure TR was informed about everything. And of course, he was getting articles to write for the magazines. Now, four of these five, not including the guy on the upper right, that's Jacob Rice, began to work for McClure's magazine, which became the Muckraking magazine from that whole period. So they eventually all moved in there except for Rice up on the top, and we're going to talk about him in a minute. And then, of course, Lincoln Steffens is the lower right. And of course, Ida Tarvel became the most famous writer and journalist working for McClure's. So let's talk about he gets police commissioner. Well, wouldn't you know, Morton Hall managed to put in a Republican mayor in 1895 into New York City. And that's why he could appoint a Republican like Roosevelt being the police commission. Now, there's a four-man commission in which TR immediately becomes head of. Whether he was appointed to be head of it or not, he's going to become head of it. So but he started using Jacob Rice and Lincoln Steffens, who knew more about his job than he did when he got there. They helped show him the ropes because they covered it on a regular basis for the big newspapers in New York. And Jacob Rice also wrote How the Other Half Lives, which is about the tenement conditions in New York. And back in those days, the late 19th century, they're horrible. Dirty, one bed, one room. Some of the people are actually rolling cigars in there as a job. And they have their whole family in there. And it's just filthy. And of course, the landlords are charging top dollar for a place to live. Like a one bedroom and stuff. It was just a one room. So it was like, and also that's when TR his thinking starts changing about what's going on with How the Other Half Lives. Because he spent some time doing nighttime strolls with Steffens and Rice, and they've all got much more information about what's going on. And the most interesting thing is, of course, Tammany Hall, since they've been in charge for many years, they had a protection racket going over the saloons. And the saloons were, by state law, they could not be open on Sundays. Well, you paid the police, you can stay open on Sundays. You don't pay the police, they shut you down. So it's definitely a protection racket. And of course, the police, you had to pay for your promotion. You had to pay Tammany Hall to get promoted. Anybody know what it cost for a captain to get promoted in 1895? $15,000. Now you say, oh, yeah, that's a lot of money. You could get that back in 2 years, just running the skim on the protection racket. So it was actually a way to make pretty good money if you had the shekels up front to buy your promotion. And of course, there's plenty of countries that do that today. In India, you have to pay for your promotion there too. It's still around today. But anyway, TR goes up against the whole thing, closes all the bars and saloons on Sunday. And of course, that was the one day that working men got off. So sure, they want to go down and have a beer and play some pool on the one day they have off, and now they can't because of TR. And so wouldn't you know, there was so much opposition to him, they organized, his opposition organized a doodah parade. Does anybody remember the doodah parade from the 1980s? Well, that was where they had a spoof, a spoof parade about the Tournament of Roses parade, which was what they're making fun of. And the Tournament of Roses parade, and they called it the doodah parade. And of course, they had stuff like the James Watt, chainsaw marching band, and they had all these, the Lemon Parade, where all the bad cars from Detroit and stuff. They'd have it lasted for about 10 years, I think it was, and it always went down Colorado Boulevard also. So it was a doodah parade making fun of something. And of course, in this case, they were trying to make fun of TR, and he had 150,000 spectators. But he loved the whole thing. Yeah, he was up on the the platform and everything, waving, everybody going by. That was great fun. And then, of course, he turned the police into merit-only promotion, so he got rid of all that protection racket. And then he was also taking action against the slum lords because he was also on the health commission as well. So he had made a name for himself there. Well, he made such a good name for himself that he got appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy, his second national job. And that was in 1897. And of course, he's quite the jingo. I think he was kind of the poster boy for being a jingo in those days because he wanted to go to war with Spain. This is way before the main incident. Okay, of course, after that, it was just, everybody got on the bandwagon to go and declare war against Spain over Cuba. And of course, TR says, okay, I got to join this one. So he forms the first volunteer cavalry regiment known as the Rough Riders. Does anybody see the hat I have on? That's a hat from the Menger Hotel. And the Menger Hotel was where the Rough Riders all met in San Antonio to start training to get ready to go overseas. And this is like May of 1898. So and I've been there, and I've actually had a drink at the bar where Teddy Roosevelt used to drink with the Rough Riders. So it's quite an interesting old hotel. And of course, when he gets to Cuba, he finds the canned meat is inedible, the one the Army's providing. So he pulled $5,000 out of his own pocket, and of course, he buys food and medicine for his own men because it was inedible. It was from the Chicago meat packing. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But he also had reporters with him there. He had Richard Harding Davis, who's probably the most famous, one of the most famous reporters in the country, and Edward Marshall, who actually was crippled with a bullet by the Spanish in covering the Rough Riders when they were fighting in Spain. And of course, you all know about him leading the ride up San Juan Hill. But I challenge anybody to remember anybody else associated with what was going on in Cuba, other than Teddy Roosevelt, just to show how much airtime in the press he got. And his own boss, Leonard Wood, nobody can remember him today. And we'll talk about him a little later, though. So that was what he did in 1898. And then, of course, he's now a big star. Okay, he's a superstar of the period. And he even gets the Republican state boss, Thomas Collier Platt, to pick him to run for governor. And of course, he wins by a narrow margin, but it was the Spanish-American war hero status that put him over the top. And now he starts really doing some things that the Republican old guard don't like. Because remember, they're the corporations, and a lot of big corporations are based in New York. But he began to meet with labor leaders, going after the tenements again in New York City, and was enforcing improvements, and he had conservation efforts. He actually brought in Gifford Pinchot, who later became head of the National Forest Service later in his administration. He brought him in to help out, to help create Palisade State Park. And then the big thing he did was created a state franchise tax on corporations. If some of you who know the history back in the late 19th century is, corporations and wealthy individuals paid almost no tax. The corporations had no state tax. Sometimes they had a city tax if they had a factory or a headquarters in the town they were in, but they wasn't consistent across the board. There was no national income tax. So they're really making money hands over fist with paying nothing for it. But of course, with TR, we got some things we need to pay for the state. We want to get a tax. And he managed to get it through even against the Republican old guard. And of course, Platt is pretty tired of him by then. So he says, well, I'm not going to support you for running for governor again, which is a 2-year term. So guess what? He says, why don't you become vice president of the United States with McKinley? And so that's exactly what he did, which he thought was a dead-end job. But you know what happened? He became the old guard's worst nightmare. He gets in, he starts saying, okay, now I'm going to start trying to do a few things. Now let's talk about the tariffs for a bit, because it's really important. Now I think Donald Trump has brought back tariffs as an issue. And I think a few of them got put in, but actually tariffs from this period of time didn't go away until, you probably don't know this, but until 1945. So the age of free trade was after World War II. But up until this point, up to about 1900, there were tariffs on everything. The Dingley Act added wool and hides and raised the tariffs across the board for an average of 47%. Average, that's almost half. So how does any foreign company who wants to bring their goods to sell here going to sell anything? Because they're competing with the locals. So, but they did. And of course, the federal government, their biggest source of revenue were the tariffs paid by foreign businesses coming into the United States with their goods. And of course, he wanted to enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act, which nobody had done a thing with since 1890. And of course, he always always wanted to do some conservation and protect public lands. That was his initial stuff. And then, of course, he's got all this other agenda. He wants to help out the working man. The railway rebates were what got Standard Oil. They were the ones that used special rebates from the railroads to actually beat their competition. So they said, no, you can't be doing that. Railway, no rebates. All the rates are for the same for everybody. And of course, that was one of the things he helped get through. And of course, the forest preserves, Panama Canal, we're going to talk more about that. And of course, expand the Army and Navy. Now, he did do one important antitrust action, not against the ones that already existed, but he did something where there was the Northern Securities Company, which was formed by J.P. Morgan and E.H. Harriman, okay, all the big railroad guys and the shipping and so forth. So they were going to monopolize all transportation west of the Mississippi. And of course, TR says, no, you're not going to do that. And he didn't allow them to form, and they didn't have it. Otherwise, you pay whatever they felt like charging you. So he managed to defeat that, but he wasn't able to go after any of the existing trusts because that's his party. Very tough to do. But he's also the grand arbiter. He was also a pretty good negotiator. He used the power of the press because he had a fantastic relationship with him. I mentioned some of those people. And they were trying to sway big business, the old guard, toward reform. Now, he helped bring the end of the 163-day coal strike of 1902. First time the federal government, like the President of the United States, had ever gotten involved with a labor dispute. And he helped arbitrate it. He had a 5-man commission that came in and did it. And the miners got a 9-hour workday and a 10% wage increase, which was not as much as they wanted, but it was first time they'd ever gotten anything from the owners, the mine owners. And so this, of course, this was in Pennsylvania. And of course, he also in Venezuela, I don't know if you knew this, but they had an incident that went right up against the Monroe Doctrine against Venezuela. Both Germany and Great Britain sent gunboats. Of course, it was the beginning of the era of gunboat diplomacy. And then, of course, he says, no, he stopped them and said, no, you're not going to be, going after the Venezuelans just to collect a few bucks. And so, and also he did the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906 to help bring the 1904-05 Russo-Japanese War to an end. Maybe you've heard of that. And that was, I think, the first award of the Nobel Peace Prize. And he got the first one. So there he is. That's in his first term, did all of that. And that's second term for the Nobel Peace Prize. But then let's talk about the gunboat diplomacy. And we're going to talk about the foreign policy differences between Wilson. So we'll come back to some of this. One of the things that, of course, TR and the US government wanted was, of course, the Panama Canal. But the Compagnie Nouvelle, which was the French company that took over for de Lesseps company, which was defunct, but they had all the assets that were still there in the canal zone. And so TR says, okay, we'll pay you $40 million. Of course, he wanted 3 times that, but he said, we'll pay you $40 million for what you got there and the rights to build the canal because they'd already paid Colombia for that. But then Colombia, he was going to sign a treaty with them to do it, but they kept asking for too much money. And so he just dropped it. So he didn't pay anything to them. And then he just says, okay, we'll just support a revolt. He sends naval squadrons to block the Pacific and Caribbean sides of Panama. And the revolt succeeded, of which the head of Compagnie Nouvelle was actually one of the insurgents, was one of the ringleaders of the revolt to take over Panama. And of course, he secured the canal route for $10 million at $250,000 a year. Now, it was, just to mention it, is that Colombia wanted $15 million and $250,000 a year. So it wasn't too far off. But TR had enough of them. So he said, we're just going to go in and take the place. That's what happened. And as you know, we had the Panama Pacific Exposition here in San Francisco in 1915, and it was actually 2 years ahead of schedule when it was finished. So a little more improvements on TR. We got, we created a Department of Commerce. Obviously, Congress had to put that in. Bureau of Corporations, to watch what the corporations are doing. That became the FTC later. And of course, it was oversight, because there are lots of shenanigans, lots of bad stuff going on from the corporate world at that time with no regulation whatsoever. Of course, the 1906 Antiquities Act, so the president could protect more land from exploitation, which he did. I think he created 18 national monuments, and he protected millions of, and also in the national forests as well. And of course, the Pure Food and Drug Act. And as I mentioned, they couldn't eat the meat that came from the Chicago plant meatpacking industry in Cuba. So he said he read The Jungle, sent his own team in there, and got passed in 1906. Anybody ever seen that show on American Experience called The Poison Squad? Highly recommended. Poison Squad is where they had all the this guy named Wiley was just driving this thing about, let's get some, packaged foods, all that kind of stuff, because people were buying more packaged foods. They weren't on the farms anymore. And so, but a lot of the stuff, they had 4 different kinds of toxins that were in them. And so the Poison Squad would start eating this stuff, and one of them was going to die, so they had to stop the experiment. But that's what we're seeing. That's on the American Experience. It's a 2-part thing. It's called The Poison Squad. It was all during this period. So, you know what happened to TR? He wished he hadn't, but he said the first 2 terms was going to be the term that ended in 1908 was going to be the second term. So I'm sure he wanted to run again, but he said, I cut off my own right wrist, my hand at the wrist, if I could take that back. But he was a man of his word. He wasn't going to go back on what he said. So he put Taft in there, and then he had nothing but trouble with Taft because Taft was not, and he was he was his best friend. His best friend. And by the end of the time, they weren't even on speaking terms, as you can imagine. And of course, Wilson got in there because Taft is running against not just Wilson, but the Bull Moose Party with Teddy Roosevelt, and they split the vote, and Wilson gets in there. But one of the things I'm going to start talking about Wilson right now, is that he had a great quote here when he became governor of New Jersey. And he says, although I try to be courteous to the men I differ from, I am always sure they are wrong. He always thought he was right. So you didn't want to disagree with him for too long. And of course, that got him in trouble later when he was trying to get the League of Nations approved. And we'll talk more about that later. But you can see this meteoric rise there. He's president of Princeton, so he had a straight academic background, no business, not even law. But he's like governor of New Jersey. And what's interesting about when he got in there, he was only in office for 2 months, March and April, and in May, he goes on a cross-country train trip, okay, with whistle stops and places where he's going to speak, and everybody's talking about running him for president. And he'd only been governor for 2 months. I thought that was amazing. And the money was paid for by some of his cronies that raised money to send him over, but they're all talking about this is just a stepping stone into presidency, and they were right. So let's talk about Wilson a little more here. This is some of his background. He believed in the new freedom. Now, Roosevelt, his program was called the New Nationalism, but it was very similar to this. Okay, but the new freedom was that Wilson and the Democrats had control of both houses of Congress, a significant number in the House of Representatives, and they had 7 in the Senate, so they could get things passed. And so they did. You can see some of the stuff they did for agriculture. Of course, they had a very active Department of Agriculture going up that way. They were also guaranteeing crops. You could use collateral for loans. They had cooperatives to help make the farms more efficient. So they're spending real money on helping the farmers out. And of course, labor, they got 8-hour workdays for railroad workers and women. You'd think you'd get it for everybody, but no, just for them. And of course, the union activity is no longer a restraint of trade, because that made it illegal. So it wasn't made to be approved by Congress as something you could do, like right to collective bargaining. That was in 1933, when the Roosevelt, FDR's bunch got in there. Of course, workman's comp and child labor is restricted and regulated. And this was all done in the first year, well, except for that one in 1916, the first year that Wilson got in there. Busy year, 1913. But also what came later was they had the tariff reform, and they're putting teeth in the Antitrust Act, the Sherman Antitrust Act. And really that started the whole ball rolling. The first big trust to be broken up was, I'm sure you've all heard of it, Standard Oil, of which Ida Tarvel, one of the journalists we talked about, she wrote a whole book about them and everything they did to take over an industry. Using the railroad rebates and all that stuff, but it had a huge influence on that was the first one they wanted to get. And so because they had the Antitrust Act, we mentioned that, you can see what it is. And also you've got the Underwood Tariff Act, of course. Remember, it's an average of 47% across the board, and reduce it to 25%. Now, what was the big problem with that? Well, if tariffs are the big form of federal government revenues, then you're going to lose a lot of money if you reduce these tariffs. So as it happened was, if they did that, it was going to reduce the amount of tariff money coming in by 41 million. But guess what happened? 48 million. What happened was they put in the 16th Amendment, which was for tax the rich, but of course it got spread out to everybody else very shortly thereafter. But they raised $78 million in the first year with the income tax. So that covered what they lost, and then they made some on that. Of course, they never looked back on the income tax. And they also put an income tax on corporations. So that make a big, so there you see the whole progression there. Corporations are starting to pay something where they paid nothing before. So let's talk about the different styles between TR and Woodrow Wilson. Definitely they had a different style. And here's one I like is that Teddy Roosevelt on Woodrow Wilson, I object to his mildness of method, okay? But he's just merely a less virile me. And that's about right, because the program was the same. They're both progressives. They had the same things they wanted to get done. They just was just about a style. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt was a bit macho, the virile leader and all this stuff. Let's go to war. We'll see how virile we are. So, and of course, TR also established some precedents with the press. And of course, Wilson did carry that on through a lot of it. He had his own press conferences once or twice a week. For the first year, he had 60 press conferences in the East Room. And of course, that had never really that kind of quantity of press conferences. But TR had a press conference every day with, he had a midday shave, and all the reporters could ask him whatever they wanted. I don't know how he actually got a shave out of it, but, because he kept jumping up and talking around. I'm surprised he didn't get his throat cut. Okay, but he cultivated, as I mentioned, the reporters as his own personal investigators. He had great relationship with the people I mentioned already. But he also established on the record, off the record, rules of engagement. And he established that. Okay, here's his on the record, you can report this, that I'm talking this way. But this stuff is all background for you, so you can write a decent, just to help you write your articles. So, but you can't attribute it to me, but it's background. So he's the one that started that tradition. And by and large, they kept to it. Now, does anybody remember when Ronald Reagan was running for re-election in 1984? He had a thing where he was in there goofing around, and there it said, we're going to start bombing in 10 minutes. Bombing in 5 minutes. I think we're going to figure out who we're going to bomb. But one of the reporters, this is, of course, off the record, one of the reporters turned it on the record, and it got reported. So you know what happened? The press corps that rode on Air Force One was barred from riding with Air Force One for 2 weeks because that one guy messed up. So that's a little by the way on that, but that was all established by TR. Let's talk about differences in foreign policy. The postage stamp here is from 1949, which was the 25th anniversary of the Panama Canal. You can see Goodles was the guy who finished the canal after Stevens left. And then, of course, Roosevelt was the overseer over the whole thing. And he broke the tradition of the United States. Now, you remember what George Washington said, beware of foreign entanglements. Let's not get involved with what's going on in Europe because that's going to be nothing but trouble for us. So it was a non-interventionist type of, and by and large, Wilson wanted to maintain that. But TR says, no, we're going to go, we want the Panama Canal, and we can't get Columbia to play ball with us. We're just going to go in and take the place, which is what they did. He says, I took the canal and let Congress debate. And while the debate goes on, the canal does also. And of course, Wilson does try to make amends on all that. But Wilson, for being a non-interventionist, was certainly had a couple of notable exceptions. He went into to Mexico. They took over Veracruz based on a sort of an insult or something that was like the Mexicans wouldn't do a 21 gun salute for the U.S. Navy ships in the harbor. And, then they said, well, we're going to invade the place now. And of course, Wilson was quite okay with that. And then of course, the Villa Expedition in 1916 with Pershing. Just a little by the way, my great uncle Paul was on that expedition. He was a signals officer working for Pershing. And of course, you can see right there, they had some people killed. And so that was not a good thing, but people were forcing him to say, hey, you better do something about these people. We can't be insulted in public. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt was one of those guys too. And of course, I'm sure he approved of all this. Let's talk about, so that non-interventionist versus interventionist. But during World War I, Wilson was pretty much a non-interventionist most of the way through, until, of course, and we'll talk about that, of course, is unrestricted submarine warfare. But in 1914, TR and Woodrow Wilson believed in neutrality, and they were in agreement. No problem there. But the relations between them really soured. Of course, they run against each other in 1912, so it didn't start off really well between them, but really soured after the sinking of Lusitania. Roosevelt thought that the United States should go to war over that. And of course, Wilson, this is a famous quote from him. He says, "There's no such thing as a man being too proud to fight." So he's talking about, this kind of stuff. Basically, he's saying it's okay. And of course, Roosevelt called him and says, Wilson is at heart an abject coward. That's because when he said this, he's a coward. And I like this one the best. He says, he has a heart so cold and selfish that he's entirely willing to sacrifice the interests of the country. Well, Teddy Roosevelt was not selfish and into his own self-aggrandizement. Okay, yeah, I think so. But anyway, Germany backed off. They backed off from that until when they reinstated it back in the early part of 1917. But meanwhile, Roosevelt, Leonard Wood, who'd been Chief of Staff of the Army, Elihu Root, and Henry Stimson, former Secretary of War, started a preparedness movement where they're going to start training officers. I think they were up in Plattsburgh, New York, was one of their big camps, and they did that in 1915 and 1916. But eventually, Wilson starts asking for an expansion in 1916. He's participating in a lot of patriotic parades on Flag Day and the July 4th and all this, but he still won he kept us out of war. But you can see they was trying to do some preparation. But of course, Roosevelt thought Wilson's idea of preparation was nothing, virtually nothing. And of course, he was pretty vitriolic all the way through in his commentary about Wilson. So after the involvement of the U.S. is TR met with Wilson very amicably in the White House. Now, why was that? Well, TR wanted to get up to 4 divisions of volunteers like they used in Cuba, okay, which we went on, got some volunteer officers, and maybe some of the regular officers would join in with that. And he wanted to send these 4 divisions over to France in 1917. Now remember, they're not going to be trained. They're going to be using regular Army officers, and Congress had approved it. I don't really understand everything, how they were able to do that. But of course, Wilson is in charge of the military. He's the commander-in-chief. So he has to say yes. And that's why TR wanted to get him on his team. And, they're backslapping and stuff like, no, they never had a bad word and things like that. But Wilson had no intention of sending him over with anybody. He wanted properly trained divisions, and if it took until 1918 to get them out ready to go, he was going to wait. 1917, only the 1st Division went over, Big Red won, and most of them were untrained. And they spent most of 1917 training in France. So, but they did not go into combat. So they waited until 1918, and looks like they've had the right idea. Because they just would have been killed. I mean, they just would have destroyed 4 divisions if they sent them over without proper training, because they're up against the greatest army in the world, the German army, not some Spanish troops in Cuba, which was what he was used to in 1898. So he also wrote The Foes of Our Household, which was a book which I read. Okay, it's free online if you want to read it. And it's very consistently critical of the Wilson administration for lack of preparation, but he was still very ticked off at Wilson for sidelining him, and he never got a chance to lead troops in battle again. And as you know, he passed away right at the end of the war there. So let's talk about the legacy of these 2 men. Talk about Teddy Roosevelt. Well, he established a new nationalism, became like the blueprint for progressivism. Of course, he wasn't able to do much with it, but he did establish it as a tradition, which was, of course, Wilson delivered on. He established interventionism as a valid foreign policy, and that didn't come back. It was all Wilsonian until 2003. And you know what happened in 2003? The United States invaded Iraq, which was an interventionist move, and it was really going back to the days of Teddy Roosevelt. But he also established strong relations with the press. And as I mentioned, he used them actually as his own investigators. He was the first president to stop a trust from being formed. That was the Northern Securities Company. And of course, he his conservation efforts were just fantastic. We wouldn't have the stuff we have today without him. And so we've got, of course, the Food and Drug Administration. And he became the foremost Jingo, trying to keep the danger of Germany to U.S. And of course, he was always pushing for the United States to declare war on Germany and then flip the war toward the Allies. Let's talk about Woodrow Wilson. He actually made progressivism a reality, and we talked about that earlier. But also he repaired relations with Colombia. Now in 1914, they signed a treaty, but it wasn't ratified until 1921, but it was $21 million to compensate Colombia for basically taking a good chunk of their land away and forming a separate country. And so I guess that put us back in with the Colombians. Okay, 21 million, because they originally asked for 15. So they get 21. They don't get a monthly, they don't get an annual rental like they would have. But anyway, he also maintained a centrist approach to the belligerents of the Great War. He walked a tightrope between the pacifists like Robbie La Follette, who was a Democrat, and jingles like Teddy Roosevelt. But when unrestricted warfare went over, because he told the Germans, you go back to unrestricted warfare, we're going to come in. So they understood what they were doing. And he got pushed off the fence. And of course, you all know he was the big player at Versailles. He spent 6 months out of the country, never been done before since. From like December 1918 to June 1919, he spent most of his time in Europe, in France, working up this treaty, Treaty of Versailles. But his unwillingness to compromise with the 14 points that Henry Cabot Lodge came up with, it scotched the deal for the League of Nations. But most of that was because Wilson was, you got to take the whole thing or nothing. And that just wasn't going to fly. So that was his legacy, though. And of course, you know what happened to him. He was trying to take this message to the people. He had a massive stroke in August of 1919. And then after that, he was fairly ineffective. He did recover a bit, but there was a while in there, his wife was running the country, basically. And then he thought he was going to run again in 1920. I don't know where he gets these ideas. And that was the end of Woodrow Wilson. So I'm willing to open it up for questions.
If you have a question for Jim, put it in the chat box, and then I can unmute you and you can ask your question. Jim, if you want, you can also look into the chat box and see what people are writing.
Okay. How do I get my toolbox? Somebody asked me a question and having a hard time garble going on.
I see some people have unmuted themselves. Does anyone have a question for Jim?
Dan Liebertson and Kathy Rowlands. Wanted to know a little more detail about what Theodore Roosevelt did to facilitate ending the Russo-Japanese War. You hear that?
No, repeat that, please. Now I can explain what Roosevelt did. Yes.
He said to repeat it.
No, you want to know how?
TR, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for ending the Russo-Japanese War, or helping to end it. But what did he actually do to help end it?
Okay, well, I do happen to know that one. Is what happened was he, it was on his initiative, I believe, that he contacted, through his State Department, it's like to the Russians and the Japanese, and he said, look, why don't you guys come here? Because they both were tired of the war, and they said, let's why don't you come over here and we'll see if you get something done. But give you an environment here that you can actually negotiate. And that's all he did. He didn't sit there and arbitrate between them. Did not. He just provided the venue for him and pretty much said, go have at it. And he put him in Portsmouth, Maine. And of course, that was in the United States. And they said, and basically I think he told them, you're not leaving until you come up with a negotiated settlement. But he wasn't actually running the meetings or anything. He just said, you put him here, you guys go at it. And then, so he actually really didn't have any big influence other than providing the venue for the discussions. So, but I guess the Nobel Peace Prize Nobel Prize, they liked it. So he got the first Nobel Peace Prize award. But actually, I don't think like I say, he just provided the venue.
My other question was about Woodrow Wilson and the Treaty of Versailles, a little more detail on where things broke down there. My understanding was that Clemenceau, the French, was insisting on the huge reparations and punitive settlement for Germany, and that Wilson supported that or refused to oppose Clemenceau. How exactly did that play out?
Well, as I understand it, is that Wilson wasn't that opposed to strong reparations against the Germans. He wasn't, he didn't fight it too hard on that because he wanted to have them pass the League of Nations as part of this Versailles Treaty. So he was willing to sacrifice some other things to make sure the Versailles Treaty went through with the League of Nations because he wanted to take that home, and he thought that was really important for the future. So, I don't think he was very much in opposition to the strong reparation that was against Germany. He thought Germany should be punished. There's no question about it. But that's as I understand it.
It was a question of how much Germany could be punished, and a lot of people realized it was going to cause a severe problem, and some anticipated World War II because of the onerousness of the reparations. But the League of Nations was something that Wilson wanted as part of the deal, and the rest of the negotiators did not support that. What was it?
No, they did. They did. He supported what they want with reparations, but he got them to support creating a League of Nations. It just when he took the idea home, Henry Cabot Lodge, who was his main opponent, because remember, Wilson did not take any of the Republican senators or any of the Republican opposition with him to France, to Versailles, to make them part of the negotiating team. That would have made a big difference, but he didn't do it.
He tried to ram it down their throats, and they said no way.
It's exactly right. I mean, but like you said, what is it? Henry Cabot Lodge had 14 points, which I don't have all of them in front of me, but he had his own 14 points go up against Wilson's 14 points. With 14 points that he would compromise on the treaty. Because remember, they could have put the compromises in and say, okay, we'll sign that. All right. And then, of course, the European nation would have to say, well, we're okay with that. So that would have to go back and forth a little bit. But Wilson said, no, you got to accept this all or nothing. And then he thought he could go to the public and get them to support it and get the Senate to take action on it. But of course, the Senate in those days had not been selected by the people. They were selected by the legislatures of the states. That change in the law was only in 1916. So the people who were in the Senate in 1919 were all people who had been selected by their state legislatures. So going to the public was not going to make a lick of difference. So he just was adamant about it because he's one of those guys, you got to agree with him. He was pretty adamant about it. So it's, let's see, I have a few questions. I have a few comments in here in
the one on
chat box.
is interesting.
What's that?
Jim, the question on TR, if he had won in 1912, or had he not won as a Bull Moose party, but what if he had run for a third term or his second full term and won in 1912? What do you think would have been the situation since he was so pro-ally and wanted to get into the war?
Well, I think he would have been pushing hard for it, especially after the Lusitania was sunk. But then again, Congress was not, the Congress was very non-interventionist at that time. They wasn't you know, because also we had a lot of German Americans in the United States who were very much against going to war with Germany. And it was just, I don't know if he'd been able to do it, but of course, he was a very influential. When he was president, people paid attention to him. And so he could probably do some pretty good stuff. But remember, in 1912, the Democrats took over both houses of Congress. So he would have been a Republican with two houses of Congress run by the opposition party. So the Democrats were fairly pacifist. They were fairly pacifist. So I don't know if he'd been able to do it.
Okay, there's a comment about TR's four sons who fought in World War I that ended up all of them were wounded, but one, Quentin, was killed. Can you comment on that?
I can. And actually, my trip to I went with Mike Hanlon 2 years ago to you know, the American battlefields, and one of the places we stopped was where Quentin Roosevelt was shot down and killed, and he actually was interred there for a while. But then they eventually reinterred him next to his brother, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who had died in World War II, and he was buried in Arromanches at the Normandy site. So that was it. But I went to the place where they shot it down. They have a little place where they have a little memorial there to Quentin Roosevelt. And of course, he listened to all that jingo stuff from his father. Should get over there and start flying. And not exactly a safe job flying one of those planes. So it's, I'm surprised that he didn't get more of his sons killed. Like, remember Kipling? He was all gung-ho about sending his son over, and he got killed the first day in battle or something. So it's like there's a downside to doing all that. And of course,
questions about tariffs.
is there a question about tariffs on here?
Yes, they're asking, is there anything
Oh,
about
yes.
the balance of trade around the turn of the century? In other words, the U.S., as it does today, imported much more than it exports. Is that the case then? It was a greater, lesser? You mentioned how much money the United States government took in on tariffs, but can you comment any more about the trade imbalance back then?
Okay, I didn't get, I have some ideas about it, but I don't have an actual factual stuff on it. But as I understood it, okay, it's because the United States was a big player for tariffs. It was just to protect industries originally, but they were using to make sure they can maintain high prices to consumers is really what they wanted to do. I'm surprised that, and look, a lot of other countries had tariffs as well. So if you want to, but the United States wasn't that dependent on foreign markets. The United States was creating a huge domestic market. They really weren't dependent on, you know, if people wanted to ship their goods here and so forth, they could pay the tariffs, but they weren't that dependent on shipping their, you know, American goods elsewhere. But also there were tariffs on American goods elsewhere. Because you know what, when you put high tariffs on your products, you can expect the other guys are going to do the same thing. So it's, but like I said, they weren't that concerned about it. The United States had built up a huge domestic market, huge population by 1900. So that was my thing. But the other countries did have tariffs up against the United States. But then, as I mentioned, the tariffs, everything pretty much was free trade after 1945.
One of the things about that I can comment on, Jim, is in 1915, when the United States started getting orders from Great Britain and other belligerents to produce weapons, ammunition, shells, whatever it was, all of a sudden we exported a huge amount of goods from this country being made for the warring countries in Europe, except for Germany and Austria. I'm sure we would have sold to them if there was some way to get it to them, but basically we sold to the Allies. The figure that I saw in a book written by Smedley Butler, the U.S. Marine, who said that war is a racket. That's the book that he came out with after World War I. Very hostile to the, I mean, daddy war books. Littleworth and Annie's, adoptive father was called Daddy War Books, and that's how he made his money. And there were thousands of American business people who became millionaires, and there are a couple that even became billionaires. That's in the early 1900s. Billionaires.
Can I add something?
Yes.
44,000 Americans became millionaires before America's entry into the war.
Right, because they were making stuff for the Allies.
That's right.
Yeah,
And
it's incredible.
another 100,000 near millionaires.
Yep. Yes. It's just amazing the amount of money that we sucked out of Britain and the other allies making stuff for them that they could not make for themselves.
If it were not for our support, they would not have lasted until 1917.
That's right.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I'm a little dubious about a 40,000 millionaires,
No,
But-
44,000.
or whatever, it's 44,000. I'm a little dubious of that number, but just because, the people who are actually making these munitions and whatever else they were ordering, I think they
It
actually
was largely food. They needed food.
food like that.
And
So, I mean,
they needed supplies like oil. They needed equipment. They needed all kinds of things. And that was the spur to America's industry beyond words. We became the industrial might and literally the creator and supplier of the war for the Allies in World War I.
there you go. It was a across the board product. And of course, as you said, the Central Powers weren't going to be a beneficiary of any of it. In fact, not only that, Britain in their blockade were stopping American cotton from being delivered to neutral ports.
That's right.
And somehow they got away with that. I'm not really clear why. They were of course, the British were very suspicious about any of these products going through neutral countries because they thought it would end up in Germany. So it's, which it did in some cases. But to stop American cotton, that was a big product for the United States to go to neutral countries. So I'm surprised that that didn't cause a big problem. But Britain got a better shape all the way along. You ever heard a quote by Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda for Nazi Germany? People say, well, what is this propaganda? Where'd you get this? Just, I got it from the British during World War I, because they were so good at propagandizing during World War I. I got everything I learned from them.
That's right.
Which is about right, because they were very good at positioning, the Hun and all this stuff in the newspapers. They were just so good at it. And of course, Germany didn't help themselves very much because they all kinds of sabotage, obviously coming from the German embassy and so forth like that. It's like, it's not going to, the orientation toward the war was always going to be, is the U.S. going to join the Allies? Not, is the U.S. going to do anything for Germany? It's never going to be there. Never going to be there. Let's see if we have any more questions. I see some things here. Okay. Let's see. I do have to do a little more investigation about the tariffs from other countries at the same time, because it was a tariff world. Everybody wanted to protect their own industries and so forth. And that changed, of course, as I mentioned, after the end of World War II, which is the way it should be now today, but there's this big impetus to put tariffs back in. Any more questions for me?
Great presentation, Jim. Really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I got a lot of big charge out of it because I learned a lot of stuff about these guys. And I was talking about Wilson, one more comment about him, because they just changed the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton to the Princeton School. And he was, because he actually allowed two of his, the guy was head of the post office and the guy was head of the Treasury, to segregate their workforce. And remember, they hadn't been segregated. The civil service and was not segregated before Wilson got in there. But he had two very racist. He had Burleson from Texas, and he had this other guy. He was the postmaster general, and they had. He became his son-in-law. The guy who was Secretary of State or Secretary of the Treasury, McAdoo. But they were both serious racists. They wanted to segregate and of course, Wilson was okay with it. He says, you guys can run those departments any way you like. But then again, here they are segregating two departments that had never been segregated before. So they thought that was a little too racist, so they changed the name of the Woodrow Wilson School. So a little revisionist history there. Any more questions? Because we can wrap it up. And I'm glad you all could join me. Thank you. I got some nice compliments in here.
Good job. Good job.
All right.
I'd like to jump in with a quick comment, but
Sure.
let's make sure there's no questions before that.
Go ahead.
So this is Randy Gulke. I'm president of the World War I Historical Association. And I just
I
wanted
thought I
to,
recognized you. I thought I recognized you, Randy.
it's been a while. I think 2015, maybe,
It's
Last
been a
time we
few
met?
years.
or
It's been-
2017.
It's been
But
a few
anyways,
years. Yeah, but it's
Um,
been 3 years. Yeah.
Just wanted to let people know, we're going to have a, first of all, I think it's great that the San Francisco Bay chapter is meeting this way. And the Eastern chapter has had some meetings with Kevin Fitzpatrick also using Zoom. And so I think that's great, seeing that it's tough to get together in person. The only reason I haven't been chiming in on some of these is I generally don't get home until 2:30 my time, which is 11:30 your time, on Saturday afternoon. So I figured that most of the presentations are pretty much over by then. But I do want to mention on Sunday, September 27th at 8 o'clock, we're going to have a meet and greet, which will be from the executive committee of the World War I Historical Association, and just 60 to 90 minutes of having a chance to get people together on this in a Zoom environment like that, so that we can, talk and at least put names to faces and see people. So I hope that you all participate in that. And down the road, we may end up actually doing some more seminars on a national level. This way, we'll see what happens, obviously, in the next several months regarding a vaccine and travel and all of that. But that's not entirely out of the question. So
Well, that
please
sounds good.
Randy,
join
Randy,
us on September 27th.
let me come in. And Randy, I sent you an email this morning. I
And
hope
the
you
answer
get
is
it.
yes.
All right.
I will. I'll gladly do something for October, Sal.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You can choose the day you want to put it and the hour.
Okay. Well, you normally do the second Saturday, right?
That's right. But it's not fixed in concrete.
Okay. And let me think on the exact approach I want to take on it.
All right. Okay. We'll sign you down for October then.
Yes,
Thank
for the
you.
Meuse Argonne in some aspect.
Yes. Beautiful.
So
Okay, well,
Wonderful.
I'm going to stop the recording now and say goodbye unless somebody's got one last thing they want to say.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening. I'm glad you could all join me.
All right there. Thanks, Jim, very much. Thank you to everybody for showing up. We had about 25 people, and we look forward to having you listen in on a future Zoom meeting. Thank you.
Absolutely. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks,
Bye.
Jim. Thanks millions.